Hello, everyone. Mr. K here again. We're going to talk about overhauling cylinder heads today. And I'm just going to warn you right now, this is not for the faint of heart. Make sure you've had your coffee and you're awake and all that good stuff, because there's a lot to this. Overhauling a cylinder head is probably equal to the amount of effort of overhauling the entire rest of the engine, especially from a DIY standpoint, in your home garage type thing, and not a machine shop standpoint. But there is just an incredible amount of time that goes into overhauling a cylinder head and doing all the checks and measurements and things like that. So we're going to go through it. But I just want you to make sure you understand here. Fair warning. This is a pretty hefty presentation. It's going to be a pretty hefty section on the test, and it's got to be done right, or else you're going to have catastrophic engine failure, horsepower loss, all that good stuff. So here we go. Maybe. Okay. Well, I have to show you this because it's just too cool. So I'm going to let that play while I talk about key items here. That, by the way, that is a four-stroke engine with a plexiglass clear cylinder head. So pretty sweet. We're going to talk about our old friend deck flatness checks, because we know that that's something we need to do. We're going to talk about valve spring tests and how to check them out. We're talking about what to do about the valve guides and seals, and valve seats and faces. What are we going to do about all that? Okay. So deck flatness check, this should look a little bit familiar from, I think, the last presentation. You lay a flat bar across it, you use a feeler gauge, you make sure there isn't excessive space there, excessive warpage. If you can't find the spec in the manual, or for some reason this manual doesn't have a spec, generally it's about 1,000th per cylinder. So if it's a 3-cylinder or 6-cylinder engine, it's a head that covers 3 cylinders, like what's in the picture, you'd have about 3,000ths of an inch is acceptable warpage. Okay. If your head is not flat, typically you should take it to a machine shop, and they will resurface the bottom of your head. Okay. However, if there's no money, if you don't have the money to do that, or you're trying to save as much money as possible, there is a DIY method. And go ahead and watch this video at this time, and I'll show you the DIY method. All right, should just watch that video. I have done that method probably at least half a dozen times, maybe more, on cylinder heads, from lawnmowers all the way up to V8s, and never had a problem. It always does knock off just enough to make the head flat again. So I definitely recommend it if you have a lot of patience and a good flat surface. Okay, disassembling the head. This is where things start getting weird. You've got to have a valve spring compressor, or at least you should, to do it safely. Okay, well, we'll talk about why not to force the valves out if they stick. All right, I'm going to back up for a second and just have you watch the video. So go ahead and watch this video at this time. Okay, should just watch that video, and that shows you how to remove the valve spring, the keepers, and the valve. Sometimes though, the valves, once you get the spring off, the valve won't come out. And a lot of times that is because the tip of the valve stem has mushroomed from excessive wear. Sometimes it's oil starvation, sometimes it's just dry starts, cold starts where the oil doesn't get up there for a while, which I guess is a form of oil starvation. But for whatever reason, the tip of the valve is mushroomed, and it's going to look something like that. It may not be that excessive, but it's no longer a circle. It's again, it's mushroomed out. It's been smashed out into more of a mushroom shape, and all those little sharp burrs are going to drag the inside of the cylinder head as you pull it out, and they'll score the valve guide, and it'll never be right again. So that's why you don't want to drag it out. Okay, or here's another one. Sorry about the picture quality. There's another mushroomed out valve stem at the tip. Okay, there's another one. See, it's all mushroomed out right there. If you take that and drag that through the cylinder head, you're going to score up that valve guide, valve stem guide, and it will never be right again. So you've got to file that off either with a file or a little Dremel or something, but you've got to knock that burr off before you shove that down through the hole in the head. Okay. All right. While we're talking about removing valves, we need to talk about a little safety aspect of it. So before I give it the safety aspect away here, why don't you go ahead and watch this video? All right, you should have just watched that video, and hopefully that opened your eyes of why valves can be a little bit dangerous. So if you don't know what's inside of them, you don't want to weld on them. You don't want to cut them open. You don't want to put them in a hydraulic press, crush them for fun or whatever it is you might do with them. If you don't know if there's sodium in there, then you don't want to do any of those things. It can be very dangerous. Okay, another thing about disassembly, make sure you keep valves and hardware with their respective cylinder and port. So the valves can't be mixed up, or I mean, they could, but you don't want to. So make sure you bag them all individually. And then typically sodium filled valves are a larger diameter. The exhaust stem's pretty big, like what you saw in the video, and you can tell that they have sodium in them. So, okay. Springs, let's talk about springs. What are we going to do to test the springs? Well, we're gonna measure the length of them, and we're gonna measure how strong they are, basically. Typical test is your spring unloaded length or free height or free length, which is what you see in the left picture there. Spring tension at a certain length or a certain height. Spring tension at a different height, which is usually the open height of the valve and the closed height of the valve. And we're also going to talk about how do you identify the spring top from the bottom. Okay. So how do you ID the spring top from the bottom? Now you could say, well, when I took it apart, I put a dot on the top or something. That's fine. That's great. But probably you're going to take it apart and you're going to run this through a parts washer and that dot's going to be gone. So how do you tell the top from the bottom? And you don't really want to put a indent in it because that can cause a stress point and then it can crack there later on. So the proper way is you take a feeler gauge. Some people use a flathead screwdriver. I suppose you could do that, but I think that's probably a little bit more difficult actually to tell. But if you take like a 10 or 20 thousandths feeler gauge and you actually put it right in here in this gap and you start pulling to the left, it'll eventually slide through this very, very tightly wound part here. And it'll be, if it's the bottom, it'll be pretty hard to slide through that. If you slide it through the top, it'll be much easier. The tighter wound portion is always at the bottom. Okay, I kind of described that there. I don't know if that made sense, but again, 20 thousandths, 10 thousandths feeler gauge, stick it here and slide it through. Should be much tougher on the bottom than on the top. And you won't be able to tell with the naked eye either. Okay, let's watch this video right now on how to measure spring tension. Okay, you should have just watched that video. Hopefully that gave you kind of a good rundown. So let's now talk about parts of the valve. Okay. These are the main parts of the valve. All I need you to know for the test are the head of the valve, right? Which if you think of this as like a nail, it'd be the head, same, just like the head of a nail. The stem, which makes sense, right? That's the stem. The face. The face is the part of the valve that slams down and touches the seat every time the valve closes. The margin, which is this little edge of the valve here. And of course the seat, which is right here. Okay. All right, let's talk about how to inspect the valve stem and the valve stem guide. Go ahead and watch this video. Okay, you should have just watched that video. Just my little tip here, I typically use small hole gauges to measure the inside diameter of the valve guide. What he did, where he rocked it back and forth with the dial indicator, that is, I would call that more of a speedy way of checking, but it's probably not as accurate. So it can be done that way. But if you really want, if you're building something for racing or it's going in an airplane, I would use the small hole gauges. Okay. When you inspect the valve face and the valve seat, here's what we're looking at. So the valve face is going to wear, because that's what slams shut millions of times while the engine's running. Okay, that's slamming shut, and it's slamming against this valve seat. So the face of the valve, from the factory is pretty flat. And then what happens is actually gets like a dent in it all the way around where it's been slamming against here. And the valve seat has kind of curved or angled, and it becomes more flat. So here we go. Here's a brand new valve. It's nice and flat. Here's a worn valve. See, it's got kind of like a curve to it. So that's not what you want. That is a worn valve. And by the way, when that happens, we can't fix this in the shop. You have to send it away to a machine shop, and they have to grind the valves. So they'll turn this into that, or you can buy a whole new valve. But there's nothing we can do in our home garage to fix this. Okay, here's a very badly worn valve seat, nice and flat. Okay, or not nice and flat, just flat. Okay, that's not what you want to see. You don't want to see a super flat valve seat surface. When I see that, I know that that's got just a ton of miles on it. This is what you want to see. See how this surface kind of has a curvature to it. It's ground at different angles, but it's got a curve to it. That's what we want. You don't want a big flat seat. The reason why you want a curve is because that's going to get carbon on it. And you want that when that valve closes, you want it to slam down and smash through the carbon. And if it's very flat, the carbon can hold the valve off the seat, and then you can get a burned valve. Like that. There's a burned valve caused by face to seat leakage. All right. So if it leaks, that's what's going to happen eventually. If the valve seat is bad, there's really nothing we can do about that in the home garage as well. That is a machine shop job. So valve seat is bad. On some cylinder heads, you can replace the valve seat. You can pop it out and put a new one in. But that's, again, machine shop job. Other cylinder heads, you actually have to regrind it with a machine. Okay, I talked about a valve, and if the valve had that big indent in the wear surface in the face, how that has to be reground on a valve grinding machine. This is what a valve grinding machine looks like. You mount the valve in here. This approaches that grinding wheel, and then it regrinds that face. Again, not something we can do in the home garage. Okay. So let's say you go through all those checks we just talked about, and they're all good. It passes all of them. The seat's good. The valve face looks good. What do you do next? Well, you put it all back together with or without springs. We'll get to that. And you do this. Okay. Go ahead and watch this video. Should have just watched that video. Hopefully that explains to you how to leak test a cylinder head. Okay. Now, if you install the valve springs, this is what I was taught in school, it should hold liquid for 30 minutes. Okay, you should not be able to see liquid come through there for 30 minutes. And we use kerosene also when we did it in school, because you don't use water because that encourages rust. Gasoline's too flammable. When you got a guy on the other side of the shop who's welding or grinding, you don't want gasoline sitting out. So kerosene. Okay, if there are no springs installed, it should hold for 1 minute. Okay, so what if it fails this test, but the seats and the faces appear good? So you've inspected the seats and the faces, they're good. You replace the worn out valves, you've had the seats reground, whatever. You do this test and it passes, you're done. Okay, you do this test and it fails, what do you do? Well, it's time for the Prussian blue test. Okay, Prussian blue is like a little compound, kind of like a jelly. I guess you compare it to, or a paste. You're going to apply that to the seat or the valve face, just like you see in the photo. And then you're going to push the valve straight down onto the seat, but don't spin it. And then you're going to pop the valve straight back up. That's going to give you a contact pattern that looks something like this. This tells you exactly where that valve touched that seat. Now notice there's a dry area there that indicates the seat or the valve is not perfectly flat. One of them is messed up. Okay, but it's not terrible, right? It's not terribly messed up. It's just a little, maybe 1/1000th of an inch, maybe less. So how do we fix that? Here we go. Here's what it should look like. Nice, even blue all the way around. That's what you want to see. Okay. How do we achieve that? Here's how. Go ahead and watch this video. Okay, you should just watch that video. So what he showed you in the video is obviously lapping valves, and that's one way to do it. It's probably the most recommended way. And when you're all done, you should end up with this. Okay, if once you lap it enough times, you should end up with a really nice sealing ring with that Prussian blue. Okay, just like that. If you don't, just keep lapping. Eventually you'll get it. If you don't get it after a lot of lapping, you got something pretty major going on. You're gonna have to go to a machine shop anyway, I would say. Okay, we're almost to the end here. We're getting there. Valve stem seals. These are seals that are, you guessed it, stuck on the valve stem, and they help stop oil from running down the valve stem and into the combustion chamber. And most newer vehicles have seals about like this, and they just pop off and on. And you pretty much just always replace them. I don't know of any, and I haven't seen any type of inspection in a manual for valve guide seals. Typically people, or valve stem seals, whatever you want to call them, typically you just replace them no matter what. They're super cheap. Like, I mean, when I say cheap, I could, for a Chevy 350, it's probably $6 or $8 for the entire engine worth of valve seals. So very cheap. Everyone just replaces them. Okay, there's just a close-up of them. All right, nothing too fancy about them, nothing too crazy. You just pop them on and off, put new ones on. Now, this is actually an ASC question. They say, one of the ASC questions talks about, well, what's the symptoms of a bad valve seal? Well, what happens is it'll burn oil, first of all, but it's going to burn more, especially at startup. When you first fire the motor, you're going to get a cloud of blue smoke, and then it might clear up. Why is that? Well, it's because when you're running the engine, you just shut it off. You pull in your driveway, you shut it off. Oil is going to pool around the base of this valve stem. That oil's, if the seal's bad, that oil is going to slowly be allowed to run down here and to leak around there or leak around the bottom. And it will go down the valve stem and into the combustion chamber, and it's going to sit there and wait for you to fire the motor. And the next time you fire it, boom, there's a bunch of oil in there, and it burns it, blows blue smoke out the back. So ASC question and answer there. What are the symptoms of a bad valve stem seal? Answer, blue smoke on startup, but not necessarily when the engine's running. Guess what? You're finally ready for reassembly. Reassembly is the opposite of disassembly. So there you go. Have fun and have a good day.